Terminator Zero has arrived on Judgment Day and it has exceeded my expectations. The anime is a love letter to the original films and I'm curious to see if there will be a second season. Let's talk about what you missed in Terminator Zero. Goes without saying there are spoilers ahead, so proceed with caution. Let's break down the Easter eggs episode by episode, or in this case, model by model, as the show calls each episode models. Model 101 refers to what the T-800 or Uncle Bob describes himself as to John Connor in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Cyberdyne Systems Model 101, meaning that the skin used for its human appearance is Model 101, aka the Arnold skin. According to the T2 trilogy novels written by S.M. Sterling, specifically T2 Infiltrator, which was released 2 years before Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, the Model 101's likeness was based on Dieter von Rossbach, a former CIA agent and someone who developed a friendship with John and Sarah Connor. The first Terminator we see on screen is hunting Ico in what seems to be a Resistance hideout, and a callback to the first Terminator film where Kyle Reese has a flashback to a Terminator infiltrating the hideout. After this T-800, I'll call him Blondie to avoid confusion, lands from a long fall, he pulls out a long piece of metal similar to what Uncle Bob had to do near the end of T2. We see Malcolm Lee having a nightmare about Judgment Day just like Sarah Connor did in that famous scene. Speaking of T2, when Misaki is in the store, she sees two boys shooting at each other with toy guns, recreating a scene where John and Uncle Bob witnessed this while performing maintenance on their car. One of my favorite things about Terminator Zero is that it also pays homage to the musical score. One example is when Malcolm is on his way to Cortex Industries, you hear what's called the T-800's heartbeat, a 4-beat pulse notably heard when the T-800 first arrives. That same music cue with different instrumentation is used in the scene where Malcolm is on his way to work. In the same scene, his driver mentions a big storm coming in, a famous quote from the end of the first film. The Eno being barked at by the dog it's walking is a callback to how the dog barked at the T-800 who was on the way to meet the first Sarah Connor in the phone book. Malcolm opening the vault with Natsuko at Cortex Industries is exactly like Mal Dyson opening the vault at Cyberdyne. When he asks her the date, Natsuko states it's August 29th, which as we know from the first two films is the day of Judgment Day, specifically August 29th, 1997 at 2:14 AM Eastern Time, and of course the month and day that this series was released. However, as Malcolm mentions, it is still August 28th over in Los Angeles. When Kokoro talks to Lee, their conversation paraphrases a famous saying in the franchise, "The future's not set. There's no fate but what we make for ourselves." As the Resistance soldiers are on the lookout for Ico's return, one of them says they'll be back, which references, yeah, you know. The Resistance also finds out about Skynet's new weapon, time travel, or specifically the time displacement equipment which many characters have used to travel through time. When we cut to Skynet's base, we have two Easter eggs here. First, we hear the classic percussion made famous in the main theme of Terminator 2. And secondly, how we see different parts of the T-800s come to life, from the crafting of the endoskeleton to the endoskeleton being placed into human molds, is a nod to the early Terminator 2 teaser of the endoskeleton factory. As this show's main T-800 awakens, we'll call him Tim, in reference to his voice actor Timothy Oliphant. We see him walk by other T-800s in capsules. One of them could be a reference to Arnold, but this is a reach, so take it with a grain of salt. Overall, this could be a nod to the script and concept art of where John Connor in the future found the T-800 cold storage and reprogrammed one of them to protect his younger self. Lastly, as we see Tim use the time displacement equipment, we hear the famous Terminator 2 main theme percussion. Model 102 refers to a card from the Terminator collectible card game, more specifically the Cyberdyne Systems Model 102 T-808 Medium Assault Infiltrator. The card's appearance uses that of the Franco Columbu T-800 from the first film. In Model 102, Annie references the ending of the first Terminator film by saying, "There's a storm coming in." Also in this scene, the music cue sounds very similar to Desert Suite from the Terminator 2 soundtrack, which plays during some notable scenes in the desert. Before Ico travels to 1997, the Prophet tells her that she has no fate, again referencing that famous quote. However, the dog alerts the Resistance of Blondie's presence, and he launches an assault similar to the Infiltrator's attack on the Resistance base in Kyle's flashback. When Annie is attacked by Blondie and Ico witnesses this, it's a parallel to Terminator Genesis where John Connor was attacked while Kyle was going back in time. When Ico makes it to Tokyo, she leaves behind a time spear, which we see the T-800 leave behind in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. It's interesting to note that another similarity that Ico has to Kyle Reese is that she also lands in an alleyway and makes use of a coat like her predecessor. While talking to Kokoro, Malcolm also lifts a speech about what will happen on Judgment Day word for word, just like Uncle Bob explained to Sarah Connor. As Misaki calls Malcolm about the kids running away, we notice that she's in a phone booth and he asks, "Where are you?" and a nod to the scene where the T-1000 asked John Connor where he was, as the T-800 disguised himself as John to fool its enemy, as the T-1000 was also concerned about a missing child. When Tim manages to stop Malcolm's car, the way it reaches through the windshield reminds me of Pops in Terminator Genesis crashing through the police car's windshield. Lee orders Masaki to protect the children, a fitting reference to John Connor ordering the T-800 to help him get to his mother, as we later find out that Masaki is a machine. We see some more T2 references as we see a guy taking pictures, the same thing the officer did at the mall as he recognized the T-800 from a previous encounter, who, fun fact, is played by the film's writer William Wisher, and Aiko shooting an officer in the knee, the same thing Uncle Bob did at Pescadero State Hospital. In Model 103, one of the first Easter eggs we see is Tim scanning a businessman for suitable clothing, a level 32 priority, though in T2 it was a level 35 priority, in a nearby building for a suitable hideout, paying homage to the T-800 arriving at the corral at the beginning of T2. We see a callback to the first Terminator film as the T-800 modifies his arm with a crossbow. Another nod to Terminator 2 Judgment Day is made when Masaki stitches up Aiko's shoulder, similarly to how Uncle Bob stitched up Sarah's back wound. As Aiko begins to rant, it sounds very similar to Sarah's breakdown to Dr. Silberman about her dream of Judgment Day. The fire burning in the background as Malcolm talks to Kokoro is reminiscent of the opening credits of T2. Speaking of Kokoro, it's worth pointing out that her three forms seem to reference the kami, which in Japanese mythology are revered deities and spirits in Shinto religion. They are often translated as gods or deities, but also encompass nature forces and spirits. Tim's interaction with Rika reminds me of how the T-1000 would assume the role of an authority figure like Officer Austin and act friendly to people he would question, though like the T-1000, you can tell something is definitely off. Rika's use of the metal pipe calls back to the final fight of Kyle versus the T-800 in the first film, and speaking of that film, Aiko also suffers a leg injury like Sarah did when being hit with a shrapnel from the pipe bomb's explosion. Tim also suffers an injury to his left leg like the original T-800, and mimics reaching out towards Sarah near the end of the film when reaching for Rika on the escalator. Aiko also paraphrases two catchphrases from the franchise, "I'll be back" and "Come with me if you want to live," by saying "he'll be back" and "you can stay and die or you can come with me." Like her predecessor Reese, Aiko manages to hotwire a car before being caught by the police. One of my favorite callbacks to T2 is Tim taking notice of the officer approaching on his bike, echoing how the T-1000 would commandeer a police bike too. Model 104 refers to another car from the card game, the Cyberdyne Systems Model 104 T-803 Light Assault Infiltrator, which uses the likeness of a dancer as seen at Tech Noir in the first Terminator film. Model 104 opens up with a chase scene as the song playing in the background, The Chase Part 1, has callbacks to the leitmotifs of the track "I'll Be Back" from the Terminator 2 soundtrack, which plays when Uncle Bob intercepts John Connor from the T-1000 and when the gang escapes from Cyberdyne. Detective Fujino assures Masaki that there's nowhere safer, a nod to how Lieutenant Traxler assured Sarah she would be perfectly safe in the police station. We see Tim successfully don the trooper disguise, just like the T-1000 did in Terminator 2, using nearly the same bike. Despite both what Traxler and Fujino said, both police stations end up being assaulted by the respective T-800s. In a shocking twist, we see that Masaki is actually a machine, mirroring the twist of Terminator Salvation, where Marcus is revealed to be a machine. We see a couple more of T2 references. Tim manages to confiscate a shotgun similar to the Winchester Model 1887 Uncle Bob used, and a SWAT team storms the office building that Aiko and Rika are in, just like the SWAT team storming Cyberdyne. As the episode ends, Aiko is carried out on a stretcher like Sarah Connor was at the end of the first film, and Malcolm realizes that Judgment Day is inevitable, the same realization that John Connor came to in Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines. Model 105's title is another reference to a trading card, the Cyberdyne Systems Model 105 T-804 Tactical Infiltrator, which uses an image from the first Terminator film where the T-800 has removed its damaged die. Model 105 pays homage both to the opening credits of Terminator 2 Judgment Day and Sarah Connor's dream, showing children playing outside until Judgment Day hits, and the fire burning in the background. As the Doctor is killed by an Eno, we hear a callback to the leitmotifs used in the track Factory Chase, which played during the final confrontation between the T-800 and Kyle and Sarah. Aiko is shown to have PTSD like Kyle Reese as Rika comforts her in the hospital. When Hiro and Kenta help Masaki with their arm repair, it's a callback to Sarah helping pluck the bullets from the T-800. In Model 106, we see a shocking behavior change in Masaki. To protect both Hiro and Kenta, she becomes a protector similar to Uncle Bob, but however, goes completely lethal and eradicates her enemies. She also manages to convince Kenta that she feels pain, fear, and love, paraphrasing what Kyle said about the T-800 not feeling pity, remorse, or fear. Tim is seen riding a motorcycle similar to the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy Uncle Bob rides in Terminator 2, and it shows off his voice mimicking capabilities as seen in the scene where the T-800 fools the T-1000 by calling the dog Wolfie when mimicking John Connor. As Kenta is taken away, Aiko remarks it's him, the same thing Uncle Bob said about the T-1000 when they were being pursued after escaping Cyberdyne. Model 107 is the final trading card referenced by title, Cyberdyne Systems Model 107 T-810 Advanced Stealth Infiltrator, which borrows the likeness of Franco Columbu again from the first Terminator film. We hear another T2 callback in Model 107 when Tim remarks negative, the same response the T-800 gave to John regarding his request to rescue Sarah. When Malcolm reveals he is from the future, we see hunter-killers, the same machines we see in the flashbacks of Terminator and the opening scenes of Terminator 2. When young Malcolm is successful with his trap, the pursuing T-800 is crushed similarly to how the T-800 was crushed at the end of the first film. We also see the famous CPU, with Malcolm looking at it the same way Miles Dyson would, and mentions trying to reprogram Terminators, a similar strategy that was used in T2, T3, and Terminator Genesis. As Misaki decides to adopt a female voice, she remarks how men throughout human history are destroyers, and women are typically nurturers and creators of life, a parallel to Sarah criticizing Miles for creating something to destroy, and how he doesn't know how to create life. Malcolm remarks, "We're never going to make it," a question John Connor asked about humanity in Terminator 2 when it's seen the two younger kids fighting each other. He also remarks on the events of the Terminator films of how Skynet would send back machines to fight the saviors in the seas of the past, and when he and Misaki decided to go to 1983, this mimics how both Kyle and Sarah used the time displacement equipment in Terminator Genesis. Tim remarks, "I insist," to the Enos, the same thing Uncle Bob said to Carl about wanting to see Cyberdyne. In the final model, we get some great references and callbacks. Misaki takes a shot in the back defending Rika, much like the T-800 did for John in T2. Both Misaki and Tim punch each other at the same time in a classic anime trope, most notably Goku, Majin Vegeta punching each other at the same time. As Tim stops the column from collapsing on Kenta, we see he has a specific priority: escort subject, making him a protector like his predecessor T-800. Malcolm manages to freeze Tim, just like the T-1000 being frozen, and the T-800 in Terminator Salvation is stopped in its tracks as it reaches out for John Connor. Kenta struggles to be let go by Tim, and a callback to Terminator 2 as John pleads for the T-800 to let him go. We get a few more T2 references when it says, "Or you can come with me," paraphrasing Uncle Bob saying, "Come with me if you want to live," and how Tim mentions it cannot self-terminate. It also mentions that like its T2 predecessor, it was sent back by future Kenta 25 years from now, echoing how John found out that 35 years from now, it was his adult self that sent the T-800 back in time to protect him. Misaki remarking that they need to get off the streets and find somewhere safe is similar to what the T-800 says to John about getting out of the city to avoid the authorities. Finally, Aiko's ending speech is similar to Sarah's speech at the end of Terminator 2, where both are heading into an unknown future. Here are my overall thoughts on the anime itself. Now personally, the only Terminator film I haven't seen is Terminator Dark Fate, which for the most part I've heard that many people are not a fan of it due to a certain beginning scene of the movie. I personally have a soft spot for Terminator 2 Judgment Day, as it was one of the first films I ever watched as a kid, and I love how, like Cobra Kai, Terminator Zero took everything good about the prior films and incorporated them in somehow. As I said in my community post, my only real criticism about the series is how some of the T-800s aren't animated like actual cyborgs. It's hard to explain, but there's an inconsistency in how both Blondie and Tim are animated in comparison to how Arnold moves as the T-800 and T-850 in the original films. Other than that, the acting was great, the story was great, and it's nice that they were able to create such a well-crafted love letter while also making a story that's not tied directly to John and Sarah Connor. If there is a season 2, maybe we can see a crossover of the Lee and Connor families. The creator of the series, Mattson Tomlin, contributed some script revisions to the Batman and is also the writer of not only the Batman Part 2, but an upcoming Mega Man film. Given how well Terminator Zero is doing and how well it was written, this makes me excited for future projects he's involved in. Big shout out to composer Michelle Bursky as well, who used classic leitmotifs from the Terminator films, as well as amazing original written music to set the tone of the series. I'm excited to see what seems to be such a well-received entry breathe new life into the Terminator franchise. As the saying goes, there's no fate but what we make for ourselves. Speaking of great things about the franchise, the T-800 in Terminator 2, or as we also know him by his nickname Uncle Bob, is another example of excellent writing in the Terminator franchise. The journey of this machine becoming a fatherly figure to John Connor is not talked about enough.